Your oxygen gauge drops by half in 13 seconds. The spacecraft shudders beneath you. Somewhere behind the wall you're leaning against, something has just torn itself apart. You are 200,000 miles from home, and for the next few minutes, nobody, not you, not the men on the ground in Houston, knows if the ship you're sitting in can keep you alive. For the crew of Apollo 13, this wasn't a drill. By the night of April 13, 1970, a single oxygen tank failure would force 3 men to abandon their moon landing and turn a damaged spacecraft into the only lifeboat they had. Jim Lovell commanded the mission. Jack Swigert had been added to the crew just days before launch after the original command module pilot was grounded over a measles exposure. Fred Haise rounded out the crew, and he had trained for years to walk on the lunar surface. None of them would set foot there. What happened instead became one of the most studied rescues in spaceflight history, and the reason it worked traces back to a culture of preparation that NASA had built for exactly this kind of failure. The mission had launched on April 11th, 3 days earlier, climbing off the pad at Kennedy Space Center on a Saturn V rocket. By April 13th, Apollo 13 was deep into its trip toward the moon, more than 300,000 kilometers from Earth. Routine, almost boring according to the crew's own later accounts. Lovell had just finished a television broadcast back to Earth that none of the networks bothered to air live. Then, Mission Control asked Swigert to perform a standard procedure called a cryostir, a simple stirring of the liquid oxygen tanks to keep the readings accurate. He flipped the switch. 200 miles of bundled wire and circuitry got introduced to a fault nobody on the ground had detected. Oxygen tank number 2 exploded. Space historian Andrew Chaikin, in his extensive interviews with the Apollo astronauts, later compiled for the book A Man on the Moon, documented Lovell's own description of the moment. The spacecraft jolted hard enough that Lovell first assumed Haise had played a prank slamming a valve shut, the way he sometimes did to startle the crew. Then the master alarm lit up. Then a second oxygen tank, tank number 1, began bleeding out into space. Within hours, the command module Odyssey would have none. This is the part most retellings skip past too quickly. Oxygen wasn't just for breathing. Inside the command module, that same oxygen ran the fuel cells, the devices that generated electricity for the spacecraft's systems. Lose the oxygen and you lose your power. Lose your power and you lose your guidance computer, your communication systems, your heaters, the systems keeping carbon dioxide from building up inside the cabin. A failing tank wasn't a side issue. It was the spacecraft dying around them. Flight Director Gene Kranz, whose own account is preserved in detail through the National Air and Space Museum's Oral History Collection, faced an immediate decision. The command module's remaining power had to be saved for one critical task: re-entry, still days away. Everything else had to shut down. That meant the crew needed somewhere else to live. The only option attached to their dying ship was the lunar module Aquarius, a vehicle engineered to support 2 astronauts for a day and a half on the lunar surface, never designed to keep 3 men alive for the better part of 4 days in deep space. So let's reconstruct that single moment, because this is where the real story sits. Lovell, Swigert, and Haise crammed themselves into the lunar module, a spacecraft about the size of a large car's interior. Outside their window, Earth was a small blue marker against total darkness, farther away than any human had ever been from home. Inside, frost was beginning to creep across the walls as temperatures dropped toward the low 40s. Their own breath fogged in the cold. Sleep came in short, broken stretches, if it came at all. Carbon dioxide became the next crisis. Aquarius carried lithium hydroxide canisters to scrub the air, but they were square, built for the lunar module's own air system, while the spare canisters from the dying command module were round. 2 different shapes that didn't fit the same socket. Mission control engineers on the ground, working through the night with whatever materials the crew had on board, designed a way to connect a square canister to a round opening using plastic bags, cardboard from a procedure manual, and tape. The crew built it in space, following instructions read up to them over the radio. And it worked. Here's the twist that most documentaries underplay. The real danger to Apollo 13 wasn't the explosion itself. It was the 4 days of slow, compounding decisions that followed it, where a single miscalculation in navigation, temperature, or power consumption could have ended the mission permanently. The spacecraft had no margin left for error, and every system the crew depended on had been pushed past what its engineers had ever tested. Navigation became its own quiet battle. Apollo's guidance computer relied on aligning with stars to calculate position. But with debris from the explosion still drifting around the spacecraft, the star sightings were unreliable. Lovell instead aligned the spacecraft using the sun as a fixed reference point, a manual technique he and the ground team worked out together, checked and rechecked against the trajectory NASA's own tracking stations on Earth were calculating in parallel. That cross-checked math determined the burn that would send Apollo 13 looping around the far side of the moon and back toward Earth using the moon's gravity rather than fighting against it. That free return trajectory, decoupled now from any landing, became the crew's actual path home. Documented details preserved in NASA's Johnson Space Center mission archives show how precisely this burn had to be executed using the lunar module's descent engine, a system built for landing softly on the moon, now repurposed to correct the course of a crippled spacecraft heading back toward Earth. A small error in that engine's burn duration or angle could have sent them past Earth entirely, or into the atmosphere too steep to survive. Power was rationed to nearly nothing. Lovell, Swigert, and Haise shut down almost every system that wasn't required to keep them breathing and moving. Cabin lights stayed off. Instrument displays stayed dark except when needed. The crew navigated their own spacecraft largely by flashlight, conserving the lunar module's limited batteries for the re-entry sequence still days away. Haise developed a urinary tract infection from dehydration, since drinking water was also being rationed. None of the 3 men slept more than a few hours at a stretch for nearly 4 days straight. Re-entry demanded one final transition: undocking from Aquarius and powering the damaged Odyssey back up using only its remaining battery reserves, batteries that had never been tested for a procedure like this. Engineers on the ground had spent days building and rehearsing a power-up sequence specifically for this scenario, verifying every step against the limited energy available. If the sequence had drawn even slightly more power than calculated, the crew could have lost their command module's systems during the descent itself, with no way to recover. On April 17th, Apollo 13 re-entered Earth's atmosphere. The standard re-entry blackout, when a spacecraft's superheated shell blocks all radio communication, usually lasts about 3 minutes. Mission Control waited through 3 minutes, then 4. The silence in the room stretching long enough that some controllers feared the heat shield had failed during the disconnection of the damaged service module days earlier. At 4 minutes and 33 seconds, Apollo 13's parachutes appeared over the Pacific Ocean, and Swigert's voice came through the radio, confirming the crew was alive. What carried Apollo 13 home wasn't a single dramatic fix. It was redundant verification ground teams cross-checking every calculation the crew made, and a spacecraft pushed to operate completely outside its intended design. That same discipline, building systems with backups for failures nobody expects, still shapes how engineers approach every spacecraft launched since. From the redundant life support systems aboard the International Space Station to the layered fault checks running on spacecraft exploring the solar system today. Your oxygen gauge dropped by half in 13 seconds that night in 1970, and 3 men found a way to turn a dying spacecraft into the only thing standing between them and the vacuum outside. What started as a failure became the blueprint for surviving the next one.